Sarah Mitchell knelt in the ashes of what had been her childhood home, her tears mixing with the soot that covered everything she had ever known. The fire had taken it all, her family's cabin, the barn, even the small garden where her mother had grown wildflowers. At 19, she was alone in the Colorado Territory, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart heavy with grief. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up through her tears. A tall, weathered man sat atop a sturdy horse, his kind eyes taking in the devastation before settling on her with quiet understanding. Without speaking, he dismounted and began examining the charred timbers, his calloused hands already planning what would come next. What drove this mysterious stranger to rebuild her entire world without asking for a single thing in return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's fingers trembled as she clutched the only thing she'd managed to save from the flames. Her mother's silver locket, its surface blackened but intact. Inside, a faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day smiled back at her, a reminder of the love that had built this homestead from nothing 23 years ago. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, had brought his young bride westward with dreams of fertile land and endless possibilities. They'd chosen this spot in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains for its clear stream and protection from harsh winds. Sarah remembered her mother, Elena, pointing to the wildflowers that grew naturally in the meadow, declaring it the most beautiful place on earth. The stranger moved through the debris with purpose, his boots crunching on charred wood and twisted metal. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against mountain sun. His clothes were practical, worn leather vest, sturdy denim pants, and boots that had seen countless miles of rough terrain. "Name's Jacob," he said quietly, picking up what remained of a roof beam and testing its weight. His voice carried the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "Jacob Stone." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the soot on her cheeks. "Sarah Mitchell, this was my family's place." The past tense felt strange on her tongue, as if speaking it made the loss more real. Jacob nodded, continuing his methodical examination of the ruins. He knelt beside a pile of debris and carefully extracted something, her father's leather work gloves, somehow preserved beneath a fallen beam. The sight of them broke something loose in Sarah's chest, and she found herself sobbing again. "He wore those every day," she managed between tears. Said good gloves were the difference between a job done right and one done quick. "Wise man," Jacob replied, brushing ash from the leather before handing them to her. "These can be saved, cleaned up, oiled proper, they'll serve again." The simple statement carried more hope than Sarah had felt since the fire 3 days ago. She'd been staying in town at the boarding house, using the last of her father's emergency money, paralyzed by the enormity of what she'd lost. Everyone had offered sympathy, but Jacob was the first person to speak of saving anything, of things serving again. "The foundation's sound," Jacob continued, walking the perimeter of what had been their cabin. "Stone works good. Your father knew what he was doing when he laid this base." Sarah followed him, seeing the ruins through his experienced eye. Where she saw only destruction, he seemed to find possibility. "How can you tell? 40 years of building teaches a man to read the bones of a structure." He paused at the corner where her parents' bedroom had been. Fire burned hot, but it burned fast. Didn't have time to crack the foundation stones or warp the frame too badly. The way he spoke suggested knowledge born of experience, not mere optimism. Sarah found herself studying his hands as he worked, colored and scarred, with the steady movement of someone who'd spent decades shaping wood and stone. These were hands that had built things, fixed things, made things whole. "You think it could be rebuilt?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing a hope she hadn't dared acknowledge. Jacob straightened, meeting her eyes directly. "I think your father built something worth rebuilding. Question is whether you're ready for the work it'll take." Sarah looked down at her father's gloves in her hands, then at the locket hanging around her neck. Her parents had started with nothing but determination and love for each other. They'd carved a life from wilderness, raised a daughter, created a home where none had existed before. "I don't have money to pay for rebuilding," she said quietly. The fire took what little we had saved. Jacob was already walking toward his horse, pulling tools from his saddlebags. "Didn't ask for payment. Asked if you were ready to work." He returned with a well-worn leather toolkit, the kind that spoke of decades of use and careful maintenance. Each tool had been shaped by countless hours in capable hands, handles worn smooth and metal kept sharp and clean. "We'll start tomorrow at first light," he said, setting the toolkit beside the foundation stones. "Tonight you rest, tomorrow we begin." As Jacob remounted his horse, Sarah called after him. "Why? Why would you help someone you don't even know?" Jacob paused, his hand resting on his horse's neck. Sometimes a man finds what he's looking for in the last place he expects to find it. He touched the brim of his hat. "Shoe at dawn, Miss Mitchell." Dawn broke cold and clear over the Colorado mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose that reminded Sarah why her mother had fallen in love with this place. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the mysterious man who'd promised to help rebuild her life without asking for anything in return. Jacob arrived as promised, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. In daylight, Sarah could see more details about him. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the careful attention he paid to his surroundings, the quality of his equipment despite its worn appearance. Everything about him suggested competence earned through experience. "Brought some things," he said simply, unloading lumber, nails and rope. "We'll need more, but this'll get us started." Sarah watched him work, noting how he handled each tool with the familiarity of long partnership. His carpentry tools were handcrafted, not store-bought chisels with handles shaped to fit his grip perfectly, a square made from hardwood and brass that showed the patina of decades of use, a level with brass fittings that caught the morning light. "Did you make these yourself?" she asked, picking up one of the chisels to examine the careful work of its construction. "Most of them. Man spends enough time with tools he learns what works and what doesn't. Store-bought tools are made for everyone, which means they're perfect for no one." He began sorting through the debris methodically, separating what could be salvaged from what needed to be cleared away. Sarah found herself impressed by his ability to see potential in things she would have discarded. A partially burned beam became salvageable lumber after he showed her how to cut away the damaged portions. Twisted nails could be straightened and reused. "Waste not, want not," he said, demonstrating how to extract nails without bending them. "Your father would have understood that. Man who builds in wilderness learns to value everything." As they worked, townspeople began to notice the activity. Mrs. Henderson from the general store rode out with her husband to investigate, their faces showing curiosity mixed with concern. Sarah could see them talking quietly, their eyes moving between her and Jacob, with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Morning, Sarah dear," Mrs. Henderson called out, dismounting from their wagon. "Heard you had some help out here." "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson, this is Jacob Stone. He's helping me clear the debris." Jacob touched his hat politely but continued working, not seeming particularly interested in conversation. Mr. Henderson studied the stranger with the careful assessment of a man who'd spent 40 years evaluating people's character and intentions. "Mighty generous of you, Mr. Stone," Henderson said. "Don't believe I've seen you around these parts before." "Just passing through," Jacob replied, not looking up from his work. "Saw a need, offered to help." "Where you passing through from?" Henderson pressed, his tone carrying the subtle edge of a man protecting his community. Jacob straightened, meeting Henderson's gaze directly. "From wherever I was before. Heading wherever I need to go next." The answer was polite, but clearly indicated that Jacob's past was his own business. Henderson's expression tightened slightly, but before he could pursue the matter further, his wife intervened. "Well, it's Christian charity, that's certain," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Sarah, You let us know if you need anything from town. Anything at all. After the Hendersons left, Sarah noticed other visitors throughout the morning. Sheriff Wallace riding by slowly, ostensibly checking on her welfare, but clearly taking measure of Jacob. Young Pete Morrison, finding excuses to water his horse at the stream, while stealing glances at their work. Even Reverend Cooper, making an unscheduled pastoral visit to discuss Sarah's spiritual well-being in these trying times. Lot of interest in our project, Sarah observed, as the Reverend's buggy disappeared down the valley road. Small towns are like that, Jacob replied, positioning a salvaged beam to check its straightness. Stranger shows up, folks want to know his business. Can't blame them for looking out for their own. Does it bother you, all the attention? Jacob paused in his work, his hands resting on the beam. I've learned that what bothers a man and what he can live with are two different things. Folks here care about you. That's worth some inconvenience. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself studying Jacob, as much as learning from him. He worked with economical movements, never wasting effort or motion. When he encountered a problem, he would pause, consider his options carefully, then proceed with decisive action. There was something almost meditative about the way he approached each task. You've done this before, she said, watching him assess the foundation stones with practiced eyes. Built a few things in my time. More than a few, I'd guess. Jacob smiled slightly, the first real expression of warmth she'd seen from him. Maybe more than a few. The second day brought the real work of rebuilding. Jacob arrived before sunrise, and Sarah met him with coffee and biscuits she'd prepared at the boarding house. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the mountains catch the first light while steam rose from their tin cups. Foundation first, Jacob said, setting down his cup and walking to the corner where her parents' bedroom had stood. Everything else depends on getting this right. He knelt beside the stone foundation, running his hands along the joints between rocks. Sarah watched him work, noting how he tested each stone for stability, checking for cracks or shifts that might compromise the structure. When he found a loose stone, he carefully removed it, cleaned the mortar from its surfaces, and examined the cavity it had occupied. Your grandfather's work, he said, holding up a hand-forged nail he'd found embedded in the foundation. The metal was different from modern nails, thicker, with an irregular head that spoke of hammer blows on an anvil, rather than machine production. See how it's tapered? Man who made this knew his craft. Sarah took the nail, feeling its weight and the slight roughness that marked hand-forging. Grandfather died before I was born, but father always said he was the finest blacksmith in Missouri before they came west. Shows in his work, these nails will hold better than anything you can buy in town. Jacob placed the salvaged nail in a growing pile of hardware they'd recovered from the ruins. Good iron, properly worked. Your grandfather understood that shortcuts in metalwork cost more than they say. As Jacob continued his foundation inspection, Sarah found herself remembering stories her father had told about the original construction. Grandfather Mitchell had insisted on stone foundations despite the extra work, claiming wood foundations invited rot and vermin. He'd quarried the stones himself from a creek bed 5 miles away, selecting each one for size and shape before hauling them to the building site with a team of borrowed oxen. Father said grandfather spent 2 months just on the foundation, Sarah said, watching Jacob reset a shifted stone with careful precision. Everyone thought he was being too particular, but father said the house never shifted or settled like some of the others in the valley. Smart man. Foundation's the heart of any building. Get it wrong, nothing else matters. Get it right, and your great-grandchildren will still be living here. The mention of future generations made Sarah's chest tight with unexpected emotion. Until the fire, she'd never seriously considered her own future beyond helping her aging parents, and maybe marrying young Tom Henderson when he finally worked up the courage to propose. Now she couldn't see past the immediate challenge of rebuilding, much less imagine children or grandchildren who might someday call this place home. Jacob seemed to sense her mood shift. One stone at a time, Miss Mitchell. That's how everything worthwhile gets built. They worked together through the morning, Sarah learning to read the signs. Jacob pointed out which stones were properly seated, which joints needed fresh mortar, which sections would bear weight and which were merely decorative. Her hands grew rough from handling stone and mortar, but she found satisfaction in the work that surprised her. There was something deeply reassuring about rebuilding the foundation her grandfather had laid, as if she were reconnecting with family traditions she'd never fully appreciated. Around midday, Sheriff Wallace arrived with Deputy Martinez, both men wearing the careful expressions of lawmen conducting official business. Sarah felt her stomach clench, wondering if someone had complained about Jacob's presence or raised questions about his right to be here. "Afternoon, Sarah," the sheriff said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Stone, mind if we have a word?" Jacob straightened from his work, his movements calm but somehow more alert. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Just checking on things, making sure everything's proceeding properly." Wallace's tone was professional, but carried an air current Sarah couldn't identify. "Folks in town are curious about your background, Mr. Stone. Where you're from, what brings you to our valley?" "I told you yesterday, Sheriff. Just passing through, saw someone who needed help." "Yes, you mentioned that. Thing is, we don't get many strangers who carry the kind of tools you've got, or who know construction work well enough to tackle a project like this. Makes a man wonder what line of work you're usually in." Jacob dusted his hands on his pants, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "I've done a lot of different work in my time, Sheriff. Most recently, I've been living up in the high country, trapping some, hunting some, keeping to myself mostly. Mountain man, that. If that's what you want to call it." The sheriff studied Jacob's face as if trying to read something written there. "Well, mountain man or not, I appreciate what you're doing for Sarah here. Just want to make sure everyone understands the situation properly." After the lawmen left, Sarah noticed Jacob's mood had grown more reserved. He continued working with the same methodical care, but the easy conversation of the morning had disappeared. By the end of the first week, the walls began to take shape. Jacob worked with a rhythm that seemed to match the natural cadence of the mountains themselves. Steady, unhurried, but constantly progressing. Sarah found herself anticipating his movements, handing him tools before he asked, holding boards steady while he measured and marked. "You're a quick learner," he said, accepting the level she offered, without looking up from the wall frame he was checking. "Most folks get impatient with the measuring and checking. Want to see walls going up fast. Father always said measure twice, cut once." Sarah steadied the board while Jacob adjusted a corner joint. "Though I never understood why he spent so much time making sure everything was square when it all looked fine to me. Because your eye can forgive what the rest of the building can't." Jacob demonstrated by showing her how a wall that looked straight could be off by nearly an inch. Stack enough small mistakes on top of each other, and eventually the whole structure starts fighting itself. That afternoon, while Jacob worked on the frame for what would become the kitchen, Sarah discovered something miraculous in the ruins of the pantry. Buried beneath fallen shelving and protected by a heavy cast iron pot, she found her mother's recipe box virtually untouched by the flame. The small wooden chest, painted with delicate wildflowers Elena had added during their second winter in Colorado, contained not just recipes but memories written in her mother's careful script. "Look," Sarah called out, her voice thick with emotion as she lifted the box from the debris. "It survived." Jacob set down his hammer and approached, understanding immediately what the discovery meant to her. The recipe box represented more than cooking instructions. It held the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had created a home in the wilderness, who had fed her family through harsh winters, and celebrated special occasions with carefully prepared meals. "Your mother's work?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, carefully opening the box to reveal dozens of cards covered in Elena's familiar handwriting. Recipes for sourdough bread that had filled their kitchen with warmth on cold mornings, instructions for preserving vegetables from their garden, remedies for childhood illnesses that had seen Sarah through countless minor ailments. "She wrote down everything," Sarah said, lifting out a card that contained not just a recipe for apple butter, but also notes about which varieties of apples worked best, and reminders about Sarah's preference for extra cinnamon. Even the stories behind the recipes. "Look, this one has a note about how Grandmother Mitchell taught her to make this stew during their first terrible winter, when game was scarce and they had to make everything stretch. Jacob studied the cards with the respect of someone who understood the value of accumulated knowledge. She was building something for you, making sure you'd know how to carry on what she'd started. The realization hit Sarah with unexpected force. Her mother hadn't just been cooking meals, she'd been preserving family traditions, creating a legacy that would survive even catastrophic loss. The recipe box was Elena's way of ensuring that the home they'd built together could be rebuilt, that the warmth and care she'd brought to their daily lives could continue even in her absence. She knew, Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her. Somehow she knew I might need these someday. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob shared more of his own knowledge, teaching Sarah to read the grain of wood to determine its strength, showing her how to identify which trees would provide the best lumber for different purposes. His expertise seemed to cover every aspect of construction, from the practical details of joinery to the subtle art of selecting materials that would work in harmony with the mountain climate. "Where did you learn all this?" Sarah asked, watching him demonstrate how to cut a mortise joint that would hold tight without nails. Jacob paused in his work, his hands resting on the chisel. Man picks up things over the years. Different jobs, different places. You learn what works and what doesn't. But this isn't just picked up knowledge. This is master craftsmanship. The way you select wood, the way your tools fit your hands. Someone taught you properly. For a moment, Jacob's face showed something Sarah hadn't seen before. A flicker of old pain, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Had a good teacher once, long time ago. He returned to his work with increased focus, clearly indicating that the subject was closed. But Sarah had caught a glimpse of something deeper, a suggestion that Jacob's wandering life in the mountains might be refuge from memories, rather than simple preference for solitude. That evening, as they cleaned up the day's work, Sarah noticed how Jacob organized his tools with almost reverent care. Each implement was cleaned, checked for damage, and returned to its proper place in the leather roll that served as his portable workshop. "These tools mean something special to you," she observed. Jacob ran his thumb along the handle of his favorite chisel, worn smooth by countless hours of use. "Good tools are like good friends. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you." Word of the rebuilding project had spread throughout the valley, and by the second week, the Mitchell homestead had become an unofficial gathering place for curious neighbors. Some came with genuine offers of help, others with barely concealed suspicion about the mysterious stranger who had undertaken such an ambitious project without apparent compensation. Sheriff Wallace made his presence felt regularly, often dismounting from his horse, to examine Jacob's work with the careful attention of a man looking for flaws. His badge caught the morning sunlight as he walked the perimeter of the construction site, noting progress and occasionally asking pointed questions about techniques or materials. "Fine workmanship," Wallace admitted grudgingly, running his hand along a wall frame that was perfectly square and plumb. "Man would have to spend considerable time learning to build like this." "Thank you, Sheriff," Jacob replied, without looking up from his work. His tone remained polite, but carried an undertone that suggested he understood exactly what the lawman was really investigating. "Makes a person wonder where a fellow might have apprenticed to learn such skills. Carpentry guild back east, maybe. Government work. Military construction." Jacob straightened slowly, meeting Wallace's gaze directly. "Makes a person wonder why it matters, long as the work gets done properly and nobody gets hurt." The tension between the two men was palpable, though neither raised his voice or made any overtly aggressive gestures. Sarah found herself stepping closer to Jacob, not entirely understanding why, but feeling compelled to show her support for the man who was rebuilding her life one board at a time. "Sheriff Wallace," she said firmly, "Mr. Stone has been nothing but helpful and respectful since he arrived. I don't understand why his past matters more than his present actions." Wallace's expression softened slightly when he looked at Sarah. "It's my job to protect folks in this valley, Sarah. When a stranger shows up with unusual skills and no clear background, I have to ask questions. Nothing personal against Mr. Stone." After the sheriff left, other visitors proved more welcoming. Tom Henderson arrived with his father, both men carrying tools and offering genuine assistance. Tom's obvious interest in Sarah had been the subject of valley gossip for months, and his appearance at the worksite seemed calculated to demonstrate his own worthiness as a potential suitor. "Thought you could use some extra hands," Tom said, his attention divided between the construction project and Sarah's reaction to his presence. "Peasants. Pa and I finished our own harvest early this year." Jacob accepted the offer of help with polite gratitude, though Sarah noticed how he carefully supervised any work the Hendersons performed. Tom's carpentry skills, while adequate for basic farm repairs, clearly couldn't match Jacob's precision and expertise. "You're mighty particular about your angles," Tom observed, watching Jacob use his handmade square to check a corner joint for the third time. "Building's only as strong as its weakest joint," Jacob replied patiently. "Better to take time getting it right than spend years living with problems that could have been avoided." Old Mrs. Kowalski arrived that afternoon with a basket of food and opinions about the propriety of a young unmarried woman spending so much time alone with a strange man. Her concerns, voiced with the authority of a grandmother who had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands, reflected the broader community's unease about the unconventional arrangement. "Not saying there's anything improper happening," she told Sarah, while Jacob worked on the far side of the construction site, presumably out of earshot. "But people talk, dear. Young woman your age needs to be careful about her reputation." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from indignation. "Mr. Stone has been a perfect gentleman, Mrs. Kowalski. He's helping me rebuild my home, nothing more." "I'm sure that's true, dear. But intentions don't always match appearances. Folks see a pretty young woman spending dawn to dusk with a handsome stranger, and they draw their own conclusions." The observation forced Sarah to confront questions she'd been avoiding. What exactly was her relationship with Jacob? What were his intentions beyond completing the house? What would happen when the construction was finished, and he presumably continued his wandering life in the mountains? That evening, as they cleaned up the day's work, Sarah found herself studying Jacob with new awareness. Miss Kowalski was right about one thing. He was undeniably handsome in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of years spent in challenging environments. But more than his physical appearance, Sarah was drawn to his quiet competence, his gentle humor, and the way he treated her as an equal partner in their shared project. "People are talking about us," she said finally, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Jacob paused in his methodical cleaning of a chisel, his expression growing thoughtful. "Small towns always talk. Question is whether you care more about what they're saying or what you know to be true. I care about living here after you're gone. These people are my neighbors, my community. I can't just ignore their opinions." For the first time since he'd begun the project, Jacob's confidence seemed to waver slightly. "You're right to think about the future, Miss Mitchell. I won't be staying forever." The storm arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, sweeping down from the high peaks with the sudden fury that characterized mountain weather. Sarah woke in her boarding house room to the sound of wind howling through the valley and rain hammering against her window, with enough force to rattle the glass. By the time she reached the homestead, water was streaming through gaps in the partially completed roof structure. Jacob was already there, working frantically to protect the framework they'd spent weeks constructing. A massive roof beam, carefully selected and positioned just the day before, had been damaged when a falling tree branch struck it during the night's worst winds. "Can it be saved?" Sarah shouted over the storm's roar, examining the split that ran nearly half the length of the beam. Jacob ran his hands along the damaged wood, his face grim. "Maybe. Have to sister it with another beam. Bolt them together. Won't be as strong as the original, but it might hold." They worked together in the driving rain, Sarah holding tops, while Jacob tried to protect the most vulnerable parts of their construction. Water soaked through their clothes within minutes, and the wind made every movement treacherous. Sarah watched Jacob's careful craftsmanship being tested by forces beyond any human control, and she felt a growing panic that all their work might be lost. "The foundation's flooding," she called out, pointing to where runoff from the mountainside was pooling around the stone base they'd so carefully rebuilt. Jacob abandoned his efforts with the tarps and grabbed a shovel, beginning to dig drainage channels around the structure. Sarah joined him, both of them working desperately to redirect water away from their construction site. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were fighting to save a house from the same element that had destroyed her original home, though water instead of fire. Hours passed before the storm began to subside, leaving behind a landscape transformed by wind and rain. Trees had fallen across the valley road, and every stream ran high and muddy with mountain runoff. Their construction site looked like a battlefield, with materials scattered and damaged, tools buried under debris, and weeks of careful work seemingly undone. Sarah sank down on a pile of lumber, exhaustion and despair overwhelming her as she surveyed the destruction. They'd been making such good progress, the walls rising steadily, the rooms beginning to take recognizable shape. Well, it looked as though they'd have to start over, and she wasn't sure she had the emotional strength for another beginning. "I should have listened to Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice barely audible over the dripping of water from damaged eaves. "Maybe I should just sell the land and move to town, find work as a seamstress or something practical." Jacob, who had been examining the damaged beam with characteristic methodical care, looked up at her words. For the first time since she'd known him, his usual calm composure seemed shaken, not by the storm's damage, but by her suggestion of surrender. "That what you really want?" he asked quietly. "To give up on this place? Let someone else build where your family put down roots? I want to stop fighting for every small victory. I want to stop wondering if I'm strong enough for this." Sarah gestured helplessly at the chaos around them. "Look at it, Jacob. Look what one storm did to weeks of work. What happens when the next one comes? Or the one after that?" Jacob set down his tools and came to sit beside her on the lumber pile. For several minutes they sat in silence, watching water drip from the damaged roof structure, while morning sunlight began to break through the retreating storm clouds. "My first winter in the mountains," Jacob said finally. "I built a cabin up near Fairplay. Spent 2 months getting it just right. Tight chinking, good roof, plenty of firewood laid by, proud of that little cabin. Then came the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Snow caved in the roof, wind tore off half the walls. Spent 3 days huddled in what was left, wondering if I'd freeze to death because of my own poor planning." Sarah looked at him, surprised by this glimpse into his solitary life. "What did you do?" "Started rebuilding. But this time I paid attention to what the mountain was trying to teach me. Built smaller, stronger, tucked into a spot that worked with the weather instead of fighting it. That second cabin lasted me 5 winters." He stood and walked to the damaged beam, running his hands along the split wood with the careful attention of a craftsman evaluating options. "This beam taught us something too, showed us we need more support up there. Better bracing against high wind. Storm didn't destroy our work, it improved our education." Sarah felt something shift in her perspective as she watched Jacob begin sorting salvageable materials from actual debris. What had seemed like catastrophic destruction began to look more like expensive lessons in mounting construction techniques. The storm's aftermath brought unexpected revelations along with the work of repair. While clearing debris from what would become the main bedroom, Sarah discovered something that had been hidden beneath a fallen timber, a small leather pouch that had tumbled from Jacob's coat during their frantic efforts to protect the construction. Inside the pouch, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a military medal she didn't recognize. The bronze disc bore an eagle and the words, "For Valor," along with a ribbon that had faded, but still showed traces of red, white, and blue. Sarah stared at the medal, understanding immediately that she was holding a piece of Jacob's carefully guarded past. "Found this when I was cleaning up," she said quietly, approaching Jacob where he worked on reinforcing the damaged roof beam. "It fell from your coat." Jacob's hand stilled on his tools as he saw what she held. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his weathered features showing emotions Sarah had never seen before: pain, regret, and something that might have been fear. "Didn't know that was still in there," he said finally, accepting the medal from her outstretched hand. "Haven't looked at it in years." "The war between the states?" Sarah asked gently. Jacob shook his head. After Indian wars out west. Different kind of fighting, different kind of war. He turned the medal over in his palm, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. Sometimes a man gets recognized for doing things he'd rather forget. The admission opened a door to understanding that Sarah had been wondering about for weeks. Jacob's precise knowledge of construction techniques, his ability to organize complex projects, his calm competence under pressure, all of it suddenly made sense in the context of military experience. "You were an officer," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Captain, engineering corps, built bridges, roads, fortifications, rebuilt towns that had been destroyed by fighting." Jacob's voice carried the weight of old memories, some clearly painful. "Good at building things back up after they'd been torn down. Is that why you help people like me? Because you know what it's like to rebuild after destruction?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the sound of water still dripping from the eaves. "Had a family, one wife named Catherine, little boy named Michael. Lived in a house I built with my own hands. Lot like this one, stone foundation, careful joinery, everything done proper and strong." He paused, his grip tightening on the medal. "While I was off building military roads and army bridges, cholera came through our town. Both of them died while I was 300 miles away, building something that seemed important at the time." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The depth of loss in Jacob's words was unmistakable, and suddenly his solitary life in the mountains made perfect sense. He wasn't just a wanderer. He was a man running from memories too painful to face in settled places. "Jacob, I'm so sorry." Came home to find their graves and an empty house that echoed with everything I'd lost. Sold the place, resigned my commission, and headed for the high country. Figured if I couldn't protect what mattered most to me, maybe I was better off alone. "But you're not alone now," Sarah said quietly. "You're here, helping me rebuild something that matters." Jacob looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Sometimes a man finds that running away doesn't work as well as he hoped. Sometimes he discovers that helping someone else rebuild gives him something he thought he'd lost forever. What's that? Purpose, reason to get up in the morning that goes beyond just surviving another day. Sarah understood then why Jacob had stopped to help a stranger, why he'd committed to such an ambitious project without payment or promise of reward. He wasn't just rebuilding her house, he was rebuilding himself, finding healing in the act of creation, rather than destruction. "The medal," she said. "What did you do to earn it?" Jacob's expression grew distant, as if he was seeing events from decades past. "Led my men across a river under fire to save civilians trapped in a burning town. Lost 3 good soldiers that day. But we got 47 people to safety." He shook his head slowly. "Never understood why saving some lives was worth celebrating when I couldn't save the ones that mattered most, because you can't save everyone, but that doesn't make the ones you do save any less important." Jacob studied her face as if searching for something. "You sound like Catherine. She always said I took too much responsibility for things beyond my control." Maybe she was right. Maybe she was. They returned to work with a new understanding between them. Sarah noticed how Jacob's movements had lost some of their earlier tension, as if sharing his story had lifted a burden he'd been carrying alone for too many years. The damaged beam that had seemed like a catastrophic problem that morning began to look more manageable as they worked together to sister it with reinforcing lumber. 3 weeks after the storm, the house had not only recovered, but had grown stronger. Jacob's modifications to the roof structure and his improved drainage around the foundation made the building more resilient than the original had ever been. Sarah found herself working alongside him with increasing confidence, her hands growing calloused and competent as she mastered skills her mother had never imagined she would need. It was while installing interior wall studs that Sarah made a discovery that changed everything between them. Working in what would become her parents' old bedroom, she was clearing debris from a corner when her fingers encountered something metallic, buried in the ash. Carefully excavating the object, she found herself holding her mother's wedding ring, somehow preserved despite the intense heat that had destroyed everything else in the room. The simple gold band was tarnished, but intact, and Sarah could still make out the delicate engraving her father had commissioned for their wedding day. Elena's initials intertwined with his own, surrounded by tiny wildflowers that represented the meadow where they'd first met. Sarah had assumed the ring was lost forever, and finding it felt like receiving a message from her mother about love, commitment, and the permanence of things that truly matter. "Look," she called to Jacob, her voice thick with emotion as she held the ring up to catch the afternoon light streaming through the window frame. "It survived everything." Jacob set down his hammer and approached, understanding immediately the significance of her discovery. He'd been working shirtless in the day's heat, and Sarah found herself noticing details about him. She'd tried to ignore the way his muscles moved beneath sun-darkened skin, the careful precision of his movements, the gentle expression that transformed his weathered features when he looked at her. "Your mother's ring? Father saved for 6 months to buy this for her. She never took it off, not once in all the years I knew her." Sarah slipped the ring onto her right hand, where it fit perfectly despite the difference in their hand sizes. "She used to tell me that someday I'd understand what it meant to love someone enough to want to wear their promise for the rest of your life." Jacob's expression grew thoughtful as he watched her examine the ring. "Think you're starting to understand?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had been willing to acknowledge. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how much her feelings toward Jacob had changed over the weeks they'd worked together. What had begun as gratitude had evolved into something much deeper and more complex. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm starting to understand a lot of things I never expected to learn." That evening, as they shared a simple dinner Sarah had prepared using recipes from her mother's recovered collection, their conversation took on a different quality than their usual discussion of construction details and weather patterns. Sarah found herself asking questions about Jacob's life before the mountains, and he seemed more willing to share memories that had been locked away for years. "Catherine loved wildflowers," he said, watching Sarah arrange a bouquet she'd picked from the meadow where her mother's garden had once flourished. "Used to fill the house with them every spring. Said they reminded her that beautiful things could grow anywhere if they had enough light and patience." "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. Too wise for someone like me, probably. Always saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." Jacob paused, his eyes fixed on the wildflowers. "She would have liked you, Sarah. Would have said you had the same kind of strength she did." "What kind of strength?" "The kind that rebuilds instead of retreating. The kind that finds hope in ashes and turns loss into something beautiful." Sarah felt something shift between them as Jacob spoke, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing unspoken for weeks. The way he looked at her had changed, his gaze holding warmth and tenderness that went far beyond the careful friendship they'd maintained while working together. "Jacob," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too. But you said you wouldn't be staying forever." Jacob stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had been his refuge for so many years. "I've been thinking about that, about what forever means, and whether a man can change the direction of his life after living one way for so long. Can he? Don't know. But I'm starting to think that maybe the question isn't whether he can change, but whether he's brave enough to try." Sarah joined him at the window, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "What would it take for you to try?" Jacob turned to face her, his eyes searching her face, as if looking for permission to hope. "It would take believing that I deserve a second chance at happiness. And it would take knowing that someone else believed it too." Sarah discovered the letter by accident while organizing Jacob's tools after he'd ridden into town for supplies. A folded piece of paper had fallen from his leather toolkit, and when she picked it up to return it, she saw her own name written in Jacob's careful script across the top. The letter was clearly unfinished, with crossed-out words and revisions that suggested he'd struggled with what to say. Unable to resist, Sarah unfolded the paper and began to read words that Jacob had apparently never intended her to see. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "by the time you read this I will have left the valley and returned to the high country where I belong. I want you to know that these weeks working beside you have been the happiest I've known since Catherine and Michael died. You've shown me that it's possible to build something beautiful from ashes, and not just houses, but hope itself." Sarah's hands trembled as she continued reading, understanding that she was seeing directly into Jacob's heart in a way their careful conversations had never allowed. "I know what people in town are saying about us, and I know they're not entirely wrong. What I feel for you goes far beyond friendship or simple attraction. You've awakened parts of me I thought had died with my family, made me remember what it feels like to want a future instead of just enduring the present." The letter went on to explain Jacob's internal struggle between his growing love for Sarah and his conviction that he could never be the husband she deserved. He wrote about his nightmares, his periods of dark melancholy, his fear that the violence he'd seen and participated in during his military service had damaged something essential in his soul. "You deserve a whole man, Sarah, not someone who still wakes up screaming from dreams of battles that ended 20 years ago. You deserve someone who can give you children without worrying that he'll fail to protect them the way I failed to protect Michael and Catherine. You deserve someone who won't spend half his time looking over his shoulder at ghosts from a past he can't change." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she read Jacob's careful analysis of why their relationship was impossible, despite his obvious love for her. He'd convinced himself that his damaged past made him unworthy of a second chance at happiness, that loving him would somehow diminish her own prospects for a full and joyful life. "The house is nearly finished now," the letter continued, "and I've arranged with Henderson's store to provide any materials you might need for final details. The construction is solid and will serve you well for many years. When you marry, and you will marry someone worthy of you, your husband will have a fine home to bring you to, built on foundations that will outlast us all." The letter ended abruptly, as if Jacob had been unable to continue writing. Sarah could see where tears had fallen on the paper, smudging some of the ink and revealing the depth of emotion behind his carefully reasoned arguments for leaving. When Jacob returned that afternoon, Sarah was waiting for him with the letter in her hand. His face went pale when he saw what she held, and for a moment he looked like a man caught in an act of betrayal. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said quietly, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. "When were you planning to leave?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Soon. Another week, maybe 2. Soon as the interior work is finished and you're settled proper, without saying goodbye, without giving me a chance to have any say in the decision." Jacob began unloading supplies from his horse, using the familiar work to avoid meeting her eyes. Sometimes goodbyes just make things harder than they need to be. Sarah stepped closer, forcing him to look at her directly. "And sometimes running away just makes things harder than they need to be. I'm not running away. I'm doing what's best for both of us. You're doing what you think is best for both of us, which is not the same thing at all." Sarah held up the letter, her anger beginning to overcome her hurt. "Did it occur to you that I might have opinions about what's best for me, that I might be capable of deciding for myself whether you're too damaged to love?" Jacob's composure finally cracked, revealing the pain he'd been trying so hard to contain. "You don't understand what you're asking for, Sarah. You don't know what it's like to live with someone who's seen the things I've seen, done the things I've done. Then tell me, stop making decisions for me based on things I don't understand, and help me understand them." For a long moment, Jacob stood motionless beside his horse, his hands resting on a crate of supplies, while he struggled with emotions he'd kept locked away for decades. Sarah waited, understanding that this was a crucial moment that would determine not just their relationship, but Jacob's ability to believe he deserved happiness after years of self-imposed exile. "There are nights," he said finally, "when I wake up thinking I'm still in the war. Times when I see enemies in shadows and reach for weapons that aren't there. What kind of husband would that make me?" The threat materialized on a grey Thursday morning in the form of three well-dressed men riding expensive horses and carrying leather satchels that suggested legal business. Sarah was working on interior window trim when she heard voices outside, Jacob's measured tones contrasting with the sharper accents of strangers who spoke with the authority of men accustomed to getting their way. "Ma'am," said the eldest of the three visitors, removing his hat as Sarah emerged from the nearly completed house. "I'm Luther Granfield, attorney representing the Colorado Land Development Company. These gentlemen are my associates, Mr. Wells and Mr. Patterson." Sarah felt her stomach tighten at the formal introduction. In her experience, men who introduced themselves with titles and company names rarely brought good news to homesteaders struggling to rebuild their lives. "What can I do for you, Mr. Granfield?" Granfield opened his satchel and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking papers. "I'm afraid we have some concerning news regarding your property ownership, Miss Mitchell. Our research indicates that your family may not have held clear title to this land." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "That's impossible. My father filed proper homestead claims 23 years ago. We've lived here legally all my life." "Yes, well, that's where the situation becomes complicated." Granfield unfolded a document bearing official seals and stamps. "This is a Spanish land grant dating to 1821, granting this entire valley to Don Carlos Hernandez. The grant was later transferred to American interests following the Mexican War, but those transfers were never properly recorded with territorial authorities." Jacob moved closer to Sarah, his presence both protective and reassuring. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Granfield?" "I'm saying that the Colorado Land Development Company has purchased the rights to this grant and holds legitimate claim to all properties within its boundaries. That includes this homestead and approximately 12,000 acres surrounding it." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as the implications became clear. Everything she and Jacob had worked to rebuild, all their careful construction and growing dreams, might be built on land she had no legal right to occupy. "Even if that were true," Jacob said carefully, "Miss Mitchell and her family have been in continuous occupation for over 2 decades. Surely that establishes some rights under territorial law." Wells, the younger of Granfield's associates, spoke up with the confidence of a man who'd researched his position thoroughly. "Adverse possession requires clear title to begin with, which Miss Mitchell's family never possessed. Mexican grants supersede homestead claims filed on the same property." Sarah examined the documents they'd presented, noting the aged paper and official seals that suggested authenticity. Her father had been meticulous about legal matters, but homesteading laws in the 1850s had been complex and sometimes contradictory. It was possible, she realized with growing dread, that he'd filed his claim without knowing about prior grants that might have competing validity. "What do you want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The company is prepared to offer fair compensation for improvements you've made to the property," Granfield said, producing another document from his satchel. $500 for the structures and cultivation, with 60 days to vacate the premises. $500. Sarah's voice rose with indignation. "This house alone is worth 10 times that amount. And that's not counting the years of work my family put into clearing and improving this land." "Miss Mitchell," Patterson said with poorly concealed impatience, "you're fortunate the company is offering anything at all. Legally, we could simply evict you and claim all improvements as compensation for 23 years of illegal occupation." Jacob stepped forward, his posture shifting in a way that made all three lawyers take an involuntary step backward. "Gentlemen, I suggest you reconsider both your tone and your offer. Miss Mitchell has been through enough hardship without being threatened by men who profit from other people's misfortune. And you are," Granfield asked, studying Jacob with the calculating gaze of someone trying to assess potential obstacles to his plans. "Jacob Stone, Miss Mitchell's partner in rebuilding this property." The word partner carried implications that made Sarah's heart race, though she wasn't sure if Jacob intended them or was simply establishing his right to be part of the conversation. Either way, his presence beside her made the lawyer's threats feel less overwhelming. "Well, Miss Stone, I hope you understand that your partnership doesn't give you any legal standing in this matter. The land belongs to our client, and all improvements built without authorization become company property upon eviction. Sarah looked around at the house she and Jacob had rebuilt with their own hands, at the foundation stones her grandfather had laid, at the walls that represented not just shelter, but hope for a future she was only beginning to envision. The thought of losing it all to legal technicalities felt like facing the fire all over again. After the lawyers left with promises to return in 1 week for Sarah's final answer, Jacob disappeared into the house and emerged carrying her father's rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that Thomas Mitchell had used for hunting and, when necessary, protection. The weapon had survived the fire because her father had stored it in a metal-lined case in the root cellar, one of the few structures that had remained intact during the blaze. "Do you know how to use this?" Jacob asked, checking the rifle's action with the practiced movements of someone familiar with firearms. Sarah nodded, though her experience was limited to shooting rabbits and the occasional deer for the family table. "Father taught me when I was 12, said every person living in wilderness country needed to know how to protect themselves and provide food." "Good. But shooting game and shooting to defend your home are different things entirely." Jacob's expression was grim as he began cleaning the rifle with materials from his kit. If those lawyers meant what they said about eviction, they might not come alone next time. The thought of armed confrontation made Sarah's hands shake, but she forced herself to pay attention as Jacob demonstrated proper defensive positions around the house and explained sightlines that would give her advantages if she needed to protect the property. His military training was evident in the way he analyzed potential approaches and identified spots where intruders might take cover. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Sarah said, accepting the rifle when Jacob handed it back to her. "Neither do I. But wanting to avoid violence and being prepared for it are two different things. Men like Granfield don't usually rely on legal documents alone when they're trying to take something valuable." That afternoon brought unexpected support in the form of Tom Henderson and his father, both men carrying rifles and wearing expressions of determined solidarity. Word of the morning's confrontation had already spread through the valley, and the community's response surprised Sarah with its intensity. "Nobody's running Sarah Mitchell off her family's land," Tom declared, his usual shy demeanor replaced by righteous anger. "My father and I talked it over, and we're prepared to help you fight this thing." Other neighbors arrived throughout the day, the Martinez family from across the valley, old Pete Morrison despite his arthritis, even Sheriff Wallace carrying official documents he'd been researching since hearing about Granfield's claims. The sheriff's findings provided the first hope Sarah had felt since the lawyer's visit. "I sent telegrams to the territorial capital and the federal land office," Wallace explained, spreading maps and documents across the kitchen table. "Jacob had recently finished building. That Spanish grant they're claiming is real enough, but there have been 3 separate court decisions invalidating similar grants in other parts of Colorado territory." "What does that mean for Sarah?" Jacob asked, studying the legal documents with careful attention. "Means we might be able to fight this thing in court if we can prove the grant was improperly transferred or that the homestead claim takes precedence under territorial law." Wallace looked up from the papers. "Course court battles take time and money, and those development company lawyers probably have more of both than we do." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexity of legal issues she didn't fully understand. Her father had been the one who handled such matters, and she'd never imagined needing to fight for rights she'd assumed were settled decades ago. "There's another problem," Tom Henderson said reluctantly. "Percy heard talk in town that the development company has hired men from Denver, not lawyers, the kind of men who handle problems that can't be solved in courtrooms." Jacob's expression darkened at this news. "How many men? And what kind of weapons are they carrying?" "Don't know for certain. Could be anywhere from 4 to 10, depending on how serious the company is about taking this land quickly." That evening, as neighbors organized patrol schedules and defensive positions around the property, Sarah found herself alone with Jacob for the first time since discovering his letter. The crisis had pushed their personal situation into the background, but she could see the conflict in his eyes as he prepared to defend something he'd convinced himself he had no right to claim. "This changes things, doesn't it?" she said, watching him check ammunition supplies with military precision. Changes how? You were planning to leave me with a finished house and a chance at a normal life. Now you're preparing to fight a war to defend something that might not even be legally mine. Jacob paused in his inventory, meeting her eyes directly. Some things are worth fighting for regardless of what legal documents say. Your family put 23 years of their lives into this place. You and I put weeks of our lives into rebuilding it. That means something, even if lawyers can't understand it. And after the fight, what happens to us then? Jacob's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. I don't know, Sarah. I honestly don't know. The bank foreclosure notice arrived on Friday morning, delivered by a nervous young clerk who apologized repeatedly while handing Sarah the official document. My father never borrowed money against this property. He paid cash for everything, built our lives without debt. The clerk, barely older than Sarah herself, shifted uncomfortably under her questioning. Mom, I just deliver the papers. The bank manager said to tell you that all questions should be directed to Mr. Granfield's law office in Denver. After the young man left, Sarah studied the foreclosure notice with growing despair. According to the bank's records, Thomas Mitchell had borrowed $1,500 against the homestead just 6 months before his death, using the money for unspecified agricultural improvements and medical expenses. The loan carried a signature that looked remarkably like her father's, though something about the handwriting seemed slightly off to Sarah's trained eye. Jacob examined the document with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to spot forgeries during his military service. This signature's been practiced, he said finally. Someone spent time learning to copy your father's hand, but they got the pressure wrong on the downstrokes. You think it's fake? I think your father was too careful with money to borrow against property he'd spent 20 years earning. And I think it's mighty convenient that this loan supposedly happened right when he was too sick to travel to banks or sign papers in person. Sheriff Wallace arrived that afternoon with more disturbing news. His investigation into the Colorado Land Development Company had revealed connections to several questionable land grabs throughout the territory, always following the same pattern: disputed grants, forged documents, and foreclosure proceedings that left families homeless while transferring valuable property to wealthy investors. Problem is proving it, Wallace explained, spreading his research across Sarah's kitchen table. These people are smart, and they've got lawyers who know how to make illegal activities look legitimate. By the time we could challenge their claims in court, you'd already be off the property and they'd be selling it to railroad companies or mining interests. That evening, as Sarah sat alone reviewing the impossible documents that threatened to destroy everything she and Jacob had built, she discovered something that made her situation even more desperate. Hidden among her father's papers, she found evidence of the very medical expenses mentioned in the forged loan bills, from Denver doctors who'd treated her father's cancer during his final months. Expenses that had indeed consumed most of the family's savings. The realization hit her with sickening force. Someone had researched her family's financial situation carefully enough to create believable forgeries, using real expenses to justify fictional debts. Whoever was behind the scheme had planned it meticulously, probably beginning their research while her father was still alive and too sick to notice strangers asking questions about his affairs. Jacob found her crying over the medical bills, her composure finally breaking under the weight of understanding how thoroughly she'd been trapped. The people trying to steal her land weren't just greedy, they were cruel enough to exploit her father's illness and her grief to achieve their goal. They knew, she sobbed against Jacob's chest as he held her. They knew exactly how much father spent on doctors, knew we'd used up most of our savings trying to save him. They planned this whole thing while he was dying. Jacob's arms tightened around her, and she could feel anger radiating from him like heat from a forge. Then we make them pay for their planning, he said quietly. We make them understand that some people fight back. How? The bank will foreclose regardless of whether the loan is real. The development company will claim the land, whether their grant is valid or not. We can't fight lawyers and banks and hired guns all at the same time. Jacob was quiet for several minutes, his mind clearly working through possibilities Sarah couldn't. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold calculation of someone who'd planned military campaigns against overwhelming odds. We can't fight them with their own weapons, he said. But we don't have to. They're counting on you being alone, frightened, and overwhelmed by legal complexity. They're not prepared for someone who's willing to make this personal. What do you mean? Jacob pulled back to look at her directly, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed. I mean that Luther Granfield and his associates are about to learn the difference between stealing from helpless widows and trying to steal from someone who's got nothing left to lose. Sarah woke before dawn to find Jacob's side of the kitchen table empty, his coffee cup cold, and his saddlebags packed and waiting by the door. The sight of those familiar leather bags, bulging with his few possessions and carefully organized tools, made her heart sink with the crushing certainty that he was preparing to leave, despite everything that had passed between them. She found him in the barn, methodically checking his horse's tack with the same attention to detail he brought to every task. His movements were deliberate and final, the actions of a man who'd made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of consequences. "You're leaving," she said, not bothering to make it a question. Jacob didn't look up from adjusting his horse's bridle. Thought it would be easier this way, less talking, fewer chances for either of us to say things we might regret. "The only thing I'll regret is not having the chance to say what needs saying." Sarah stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Are you running from the fight with Granfield, or are you running from me? I'm trying to protect you from both." Jacob's voice carried the strain of a man fighting his own desires. "Those hired guns Granfield's bringing, they're not coming for a legal dispute. They're coming to hurt people, maybe kill people, until everyone gets tired of fighting and gives up. You don't need to be part of that kind of violence. And you think leaving will keep me safe? You think I'll be better protected facing those men alone than I would be with you beside me?" Jacob's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain behind his careful reasoning. "I think you'll be safer if there's no reason for them to see you as a threat. Right now, they want your land. If I stay and we fight them together, they'll want revenge too. The difference between those two things could get you killed." Sarah felt anger building in her chest, not at Jacob's concern for her safety, but his willingness to make crucial decisions without consulting her. "Don't you think that should be my choice to make? Don't you think I've earned the right to decide what risks I'm willing to take for something that matters to me? You don't understand what you're asking for. Then help me understand. Stop treating me like a child who can't handle difficult truths, and tell me exactly what you're afraid of." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on his horse's neck while he struggled with memories he'd kept buried for years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the morning sounds of birds and wind through the mountains. "I've killed men, Sarah, not in battles where everyone expected violence, but face to face, close enough to see their eyes when they realized they weren't going home to their families. I've done things in the name of duty and survival that I'll carry with me until I die. And you think that makes you unworthy of love? You think past violence disqualifies you from building something peaceful? I think it means I attract the kind of trouble that destroys innocent people. Granfield's hired guns, they're not going to play by gentlemen's rules. When they come, and they will come, people are going to get hurt, maybe killed. I won't be responsible for bringing that kind of darkness into your life." Sarah studied Jacob's face, seeing the genuine anguish behind his practical arguments. He wasn't just trying to protect her from external threats. He was trying to protect her from himself, from aspects of his character that he considered too damaged for redemption. "What if I told you that I'm not as innocent as you think I am? What if I told you that I've been angry enough to want to hurt people, scared enough to consider running away, desperate enough to think about giving up on everything I've ever cared about?" That's different. Those are feelings, not actions. The only difference between feelings and actions is choice, Jacob. You chose to be a soldier when your country needed defending. You chose to help me rebuild when I needed hope. You're choosing to leave now because you think it will keep me safe. All of those choices came from the same heart. Jacob's horse stamped restlessly, sensing the emotional tension between them. Sarah moved closer, placing her hand on Jacob's arm and feeling the muscles tighten beneath her touch. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need protection," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to stay because I love you, and because I believe you love me too. I'm asking you to trust that we're stronger together than we are apart, even when facing things that seem impossible." Jacob looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face with an expression that held equal measures of hope and despair. "What if you're wrong? What if choosing me means choosing a life filled with violence and regret? Then we'll face that together too. But I'd rather live one honest year with you than 50 safe years wondering what we might have built together." The confrontation came at dawn on Monday morning, exactly as Jacob had predicted. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as 8 riders approached the homestead, their horses kicking up dust clouds that caught the early sunlight like smoke. At the front rode Luther Granfield, flanked by men who carried themselves with the casual confidence of professional violence. Jacob stood in the doorway of the completed house, holding the key he'd crafted himself from iron salvaged from the original structure. The key was more than functional hardware. It was a symbol of everything they'd built together, of home and belonging, and the right to defend what mattered most. His other hand rested casually on the rifle propped against the doorframe, a gesture that managed to seem both relaxed and threatening. "Miss Mitchell," Granfield called out, dismounting from his expensive horse while his hired men remained mounted and watchful. "I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer. We're prepared to conclude this business today and allow you to relocate with minimal disruption." Sarah emerged from the house to stand beside Jacob, noting how the hired gunman's eyes tracked her movement and calculated angles of attack. These weren't men accustomed to negotiation. They were men who solved problems with intimidation and, when necessary, violence. "Mr. Granfield," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt, "I've considered your offer very carefully, and I've decided to reject it. This is my family's land, and I intend to keep it. I'm afraid that's not an option, Miss Mitchell. The foreclosure proceedings began this morning, and the bank has already filed papers transferring ownership to our company. You're now trespassing on private property." Jacob stepped forward, his movement subtle but unmistakably protective. "Funny thing about foreclosure proceedings, Mr. Granfield, they require authentic documentation, and it turns out that loan you're foreclosing on never actually existed." Granfield's expression tightened slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Stone, but I assure you that all our documentation has been properly verified by appropriate authorities." "Then you won't mind explaining how Thomas Mitchell supposedly signed loan papers in Denver on a day when he was too sick to leave his bed? Or how his signature managed to change style between the supposed loan documents and letters he wrote the same month?" Sarah felt a surge of pride as Jacob spoke with quiet authority, dismantling Granfield's carefully constructed fraud with evidence she hadn't known he'd been gathering. While she'd been focused on construction work, he'd apparently been conducting his own investigation into the claims against her property. One of Granfield's hired men, a lean man with scarred hands and cold eyes, grew visibly impatient with the legal discussion. "Boss, we're wasting time. Just tell the lady to pack her things and move along, or we'll move her along ourselves." "I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion, Mr. Crenshaw," Jacob said, his tone remaining conversational despite the obvious threat. "This is a discussion between property owners and their legal representatives. Hired thugs don't generally participate in such conversations." Crenshaw's face flushed with anger at Jacob's dismissive tone. "You got a smart mouth, mountain man. Maybe it's time someone taught you some manners." "Maybe it is." Jacob's reply was quiet, almost gentle, but something in his voice made Crenshaw's hand move instinctively toward his gun before stopping short of drawing it. The moment of near violence crystallized the situation for everyone present. This wasn't going to be resolved through legal maneuvering or financial negotiation. It was going to come down to who was willing to fight harder for what they believed they deserved. "Gentlemen," Granfield said, clearly trying to regain control of a situation that was escalating beyond his comfort level, I'm sure we can resolve this matter without unnecessary unpleasantness. Miss Mitchell, surely you can see the wisdom of accepting our terms rather than forcing us to pursue less agreeable alternatives. Sarah looked around at the men surrounding her home. Some nervous, some eager for violence, all of them representing forces that would happily destroy her life for profit. Then she looked at Jacob standing steady and calm beside her, and felt something shift in her perspective. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd knelt weeping in the ashes of her family's home. She was a woman who'd learned to swing a hammer, who'd helped rebuild something beautiful from destruction, who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances. She was someone worth defending, and she was standing beside someone worth fighting for. "Mr. Granfield," she said, her voice carrying new strength, "the only alternative I'm interested in is the one where you and your men get off my property and never come back. Right now." She reached out and took the key from Jacob's hand, holding it up where everyone could see the symbol of everything they'd built together. "This is our home. We built it together. We'll defend it together, and we'll live in it together. If you want to take it from us, you're going to have to fight us for it." The sound of gunshots echoed across the valley for nearly an hour, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch forever. When Sheriff Wallace arrived with his deputies and a telegram from the territorial governor declaring the Colorado Land Development Company's activities illegal, he found Luther Granfield and his remaining men in full retreat, their horses kicking up dust clouds as they fled toward the main road. Jacob sat on the front steps of the house they'd built together, methodically cleaning his rifle while Sarah tended to a graze on his shoulder where one of Crenshaw's bullets had found its mark. The wound was superficial, but the sight of Jacob's blood on her hands had transformed Sarah's understanding of what it meant to fight for something precious. "Is it over?" she asked, watching the last of Granfield's riders disappear over the ridge. "For now." Jacob tested his shoulder's range of motion, wincing slightly at the movement. "Men like that don't give up easy, but they also don't waste time on fights that stop being profitable. Word of what happened here will spread, and other folks they're trying to cheat will know they can be beaten." Sheriff Wallace dismounted and approached them with a mixture of relief and admiration. "That was some fine shooting, Stone. Don't think I've ever seen anyone handle 8 armed men with that kind of precision." "Wasn't about the shooting, Sheriff. Was about making it clear that some things are worth whatever it costs to defend them." That afternoon, neighbors began arriving to help repair damage from the brief but intense battle. The Hendersons brought lumber to replace boards splintered by gunfire. The Martinos family contributed labor and food for the work crews, and even old Pete Morrison hobbled over with tales of his own conflicts with land grabbers during the early territorial days. "Your father would be proud," Miss Henderson told Sarah, watching Jacob direct repairs to the front porch, where most of the damage had occurred. "Thomas Mitchell built more than just a homestead here. He built something worth fighting for." As evening approached and the last of the neighbors departed, Sarah found herself alone with Jacob for the first time since the morning's confrontation. They sat together on the repaired front steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to partners, to something deeper than either had expected to find. "The house is finished," Jacob said quietly, his words carrying implications beyond their literal meaning. "Yes, it is. Question is, what happens now? We built it together, but we never talked about what comes after the building's done." Sarah looked at the key in her hands, the key Jacob had crafted from iron that had survived fire, the key that represented home and belonging and the choice to stay rather than run. She understood that his question wasn't really about construction schedules or future projects. "I know what I want to happen," she said carefully. "But I also know that wanting something doesn't make it possible, especially when the other person involved has spent years convincing himself he doesn't deserve happiness." Jacob was quiet for several minutes, his gaze fixed on the mountains that had been his refuge for so long. "I've been thinking about what you said, about choice being the difference between feelings and actions, about trusting that we're stronger together than apart. And I think maybe it's time I stopped letting fear make my choices for me." He turned to look at her directly, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, hope tempered by hard-won wisdom, love that had survived testing by fire and violence. "Sarah Mitchell," he said formally, "would you consider sharing this house with a man who's got more past than future, who wakes up some nights thinking he's still fighting wars that ended years ago, who's never going to be anything other than what he is right now?" Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Jacob Stone, I can't think of anything I'd rather do than share this house and this life with exactly the man you are right now." He leaned over and kissed her then, gently at first and then with increasing intensity, as they both realized that the long journey from destruction to rebuilding, from loneliness to love, from fear to trust, was finally complete. The house they'd built together stood solid and strong around them, but the home they'd created existed in the space between their hearts, where hope had taken root and grown into something that could survive any storm. When they finally broke apart, Jacob pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden box he'd crafted during quiet evening hours, carved with wildflowers like those that grew in the meadow where Sarah's mother had first fallen in love with this place. Inside the box was a ring he'd made himself, simple gold band with Sarah's name engraved inside, surrounded by tiny wildflowers that matched those on her mother's recipe box. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood before the mirror in what had once been her parents' bedroom, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn herself using patterns from her mother's sewing box. The dress wasn't elaborate. They had neither the money nor the inclination for fancy wedding attire, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, made from fabric that would serve her well as a wife and partner in the life she and Jacob were building together. The dress had been her mother's design, discovered among Elena's papers, along with detailed notes about the kind of wedding dress she'd always imagined for her daughter. Sarah had followed the pattern exactly, adding only small touches that reflected her own personality. Stronger seams for a woman who expected to work hard, and pockets for practical items because she'd learned the value of always having useful things close at hand. Outside her window, she could see neighbors arriving for the ceremony that would take place in the meadow where her mother had grown wildflowers, where the original cabin had stood, where she and Jacob had first begun the work of rebuilding. Reverend Cooper had initially expressed concerns about performing a wedding ceremony on land that had recently seen gunfire, but Sarah had convinced him that there was no more appropriate place to celebrate new beginnings and ground that had witnessed both destruction and renewal. Mrs. Henderson bustled into the room carrying a bouquet of wildflowers identical to those her mother had carried at her own wedding 24 years earlier. "Your mother would be so pleased," she said, tears in her eyes as she helped Sarah with the final adjustments to her dress. "She always said you'd marry a man who could build things with his hands and his heart." "Did she really say that?" "Word for word. Said you'd need someone strong enough to match your determination and gentle enough to appreciate your kindness." "I think she would have approved of Jacob Stone." Sarah looked out the window again and saw Jacob standing near the altar. Tom Henderson and his father had constructed from lumber left over from the house construction. He was wearing his best clothes, still simple working man's attire, but clean and carefully maintained, and talking quietly with Sheriff Wallace, who would serve as best man in the absence of family members who could travel such distances. The sight of Jacob waiting for her made Sarah's heart race with anticipation, mixed with nervous excitement. They'd survived fire, storm, legal threats, and armed conflict together, but somehow the prospect of promising to share their entire lives felt like the most daunting challenge they'd yet faced. A soft knock on the door announced the arrival of Rebecca Martinez, who had volunteered to help with final preparations and serve as Sarah's matron of honor. Rebecca had become one of Sarah's closest friends during the rebuilding process, offering both practical assistance and emotional support during the most difficult periods. "Time to go," Rebecca said gently, peeking through the doorway. "Everyone's ready, and Jacob looks like he might wear a hole in the ground if he has to wait much longer." Sarah took one final look around the bedroom she'd shared with memories of her parents for so many years, the room where she'd grieved their deaths and planned her future, the room that would soon become the space she shared with Jacob as they began their married life together. The transformation felt complete and appropriate, honoring the past while embracing the future. As she walked through the house toward the front door, Sarah noticed details she and Jacob had worked so hard to perfect. The carefully fitted joints in the door frames, the level floors that had required such meticulous attention to the foundation, the windows that let in just the right amount of mountain sunlight. Every board and nail represented hours of shared labor, conversations about the future, and growing trust between two people who had found each other when they both needed hope most desperately. The front door opened onto the porch, where Jacob had crafted the key that now hung on a chain around Sarah's neck, visible above the neckline of her wedding dress. The key had become her most precious possession, representing not just access to a physical structure, but entry into a life she'd helped create through determination, courage, and love. Outside, the assembled neighbors and friends rose to their feet as Sarah appeared, their faces showing the kind of genuine happiness that comes from witnessing two people who clearly belong together, finally acknowledging what everyone else had seen for weeks. The ceremony would be simple, conducted in the shadow of mountains that had sheltered their courtship and under skies that had seen them through every challenge they'd faced together. Jacob stepped forward to meet her halfway, offering his arm as they walked together toward the altar, and the promises that would transform them from partners in construction to partners in life. 5 years had passed since the morning Sarah knelt weeping in the ashes of her childhood home, and the woman who now stood in the doorway of the house she'd rebuilt with Jacob bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who'd thought her life was over. Her hands, once soft from domestic work, were now calloused from years of shared labor on the expanding homestead. Her eyes, once clouded with grief, now sparkled with contentment and anticipation as she watched her husband play with their 3-year-old son in the front yard. Little Thomas Stone, named for Sarah's father, but carrying Jacob's surname, had inherited his mother's determination and his father's careful attention to how things worked. Sarah smiled as she watched him attempt to help Jacob repair a section of fence, his small hands mimicking his father's movements while accomplishing very little actual work. The child's wooden toy horse, carved by Jacob during the long winter evenings when snow made outdoor projects impossible, lay forgotten in the grass, while Thomas focused entirely on the important business of being helpful. The homestead had grown considerably since their wedding day. Jacob's skills and Sarah's organizational abilities had created not just a home, but a thriving operation that provided income as well as shelter. Jacob had established a reputation throughout the valley for fine carpentry work, and Sarah's preserves and baked goods were in constant demand in town. Their success had come from the same patient attention to detail that had characterized their original rebuilding project. Careful planning, quality materials, and the willingness to take whatever time was necessary to do things properly. "Mama, look," Thomas called out, holding up a bent nail he'd managed to extract from a piece of old lumber. "I fixed it like Papa." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Sarah replied, noting how Jacob's face lit up at their son's pride in useful work. Thomas was too young to understand the significance of salvaging damaged materials, but he was already learning the habits of mind that had made his parents successful: waste nothing, repair what can be repaired, and take satisfaction in work well done. The afternoon mail brought a letter from Sarah's cousin in Missouri, filled with news from relatives who had initially expressed skepticism about her decision to marry a mysterious mountain man and remain in the Colorado Territory. Their doubts had faded, as Sarah's letters described a marriage built on mutual respect, shared work, and growing prosperity. The cousin's letter contained an invitation to visit, along with admissions that Sarah's unconventional choices had inspired other family members to reconsider their own assumptions about what constituted a proper life. As evening approached, Sarah and Jacob sat together on the porch they'd built during their 2nd year of marriage, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the meadow where wildflowers grew in abundance. The child's laughter mixed with the sound of wind through the mountains and the distant call of owls beginning their nightly hunting. These were the sounds of peace. Sarah realized, the sounds of a life rebuilt from nothing and sustained by love, work, and the courage to believe in possibilities that couldn't be seen at the beginning. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day? Sarah asked, resting her head against Jacob's shoulder while they watched their sons play. "Every day," Jacob replied quietly, but not with regret, with gratitude. "Gratitude for the fire that brought me to you, for the storm that taught us how to build stronger, for the fight that showed us what we were willing to defend. All of it led us here, to this moment, to this life we've made together." Sarah understood what he meant. Every challenge they'd faced, every moment when giving up had seemed like the rational choice, had been a necessary step in the journey that had brought them to this place of contentment and hope. The mountain man who had found her crying at her burned house had rebuilt far more than walls and roof. He had rebuilt her faith in the future, her belief in the possibility of love after loss, her understanding of her own strength. Thomas ran toward them as darkness began to fall, his small face glowing with the simple happiness of a child who had spent the day surrounded by parents who loved each other, and him with equal devotion. Jacob scooped him up and carried him inside for his evening routine, while Sarah remained on the porch for a few more minutes, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to family. In the distance she could see lights beginning to flicker on in neighbors' homes throughout the valley. The Henderson place, the Martinez farm, even old Pete Morrison's cabin tucked against the hillside. Each light represented a family, a story, a group of people who had chosen to build their lives in this challenging but beautiful place. Sarah felt grateful to be part of that community, to have earned her place among people who understood that the best things in life required patience, courage, and the willingness to begin again when necessary. The house behind her glowed with warm lamplight, and she could hear Jacob's voice reading to Thomas from one of the books they'd ordered from Denver. Soon she would join them for the evening rituals that had become as important to their family's happiness as the morning routines of shared coffee and planning the day's work. But for now, she remained on the porch, holding the moment in memory, understanding that this was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of love strong enough to survive whatever challenges the future might bring. The mountain man had found her crying at her burned house, had rebuilt it without asking for payment, and in doing so had given her something more valuable than shelter. He had given her a life worth living, a love worth defending, and a future worth building one careful day at a time.